There's a video that I've been wanting to do for quite some time, but that nevertheless I've been putting off. As this channel approaches its first hiatus, I've been blowing the dust off a lot of old projects that I've intended to get around to. And one of those projects has been to make a video, or perhaps a set of videos, dedicated to advice I would give to other people interested in becoming leaders or activists in the culture war, regardless of whether you participate in politics properly or just keep up with internet happenings. If you're interested in the future of our society at all, you probably understand that Western civilization, that societies in the global West are experiencing a type of cultural crisis, a battle over what their identities are and what their identities will be going forward into the future. This culture war, for lack of a better term, is the most salient point of our own political age. And if you watch my channel, there are probably one or two things you've picked up about this culture war. First, that a victory by cultural progressivism or cultural leftism would be disastrous to the prospects of the human race and human thriving even in the short term. Second, that this cultural progressive force, this cultural global leftism, is institutionally dominant and currently winning, at least when it comes to cultural and narrative discourse, both in the United States, in Europe, and worldwide. And third, finally, that current forms of right-wing thinking and right-wing activism have, to this point at least, been very ineffective. And to confront the issues we are currently dealing with inside this culture war, we need to think out of the box and develop new paths forward. We need to find a turning point in the culture war. Now, with these three sort of overall channel messages that come up again and again in my videos, I think it's not surprising that a lot of people ask me, well, what can we do to make things better? How can we take proactive steps to actually make progress? I mean, talking about things on YouTube is all well and good, but it doesn't really make progress. It doesn't take us materially forward in any meaningful way. This concern is justified, but oftentimes very frustrating. As is always said, it's easier said than done. Moreover, there is a certain core asymmetry inside the culture war as we understand it today. The left doesn't need to do as much. They're more developed, they have greater institutional control, and even without this institutional power advantage, it is simply in the nature of the left to require less effort. Giving in to indulgences, letting the order of past societies eventually decay, organizing civilization around consumption and around need is easy. It basically just requires showing up and being counted. But for those on the counter-progressive side who are seeking a more transcendent, a more meaningful existence, no such complacency will do, or will achieve the ends that they really want. We can't make any meaningful progress by indulging ourselves. We can't take civilization and humanity forward just by doing the easy thing. Furthermore, reactionaries know that history is shaped by people who are leaders, people who take charge and take risks. And just being a member of a mass movement won't do. Something more is required. To be more specific, leaders are required. But while I recognize this basic truth about history, generally, I oftentimes think people overestimate what it means to be a leader. While Pareto's famous rule is true, 20% of the subjects create 80% of the outcome, 20%'s a big number, and for my money, most of the events in history were done by small, unsung heroes that we'll never hear about in any proper history book. Still, that which was accomplished through discipline and virtue. It was accomplished through leadership, and in human terms, that's no small feat. And therein lies even more questions, more problems. I suppose in the context of this reality, it's not surprising that a lot of people ask me what they can do to become better leaders, what they can do to advance the cause. To address these questions, at least among the people who contacted me on Discord, I had wrote up a little pamphlet that I called The Culture War and Content Creation, a sort of top 10 list that people could use to figure out what they might be able to do to make things materially better, what type of leadership they could perform in their own lives. As time went on, I added to this document until my Discord server finally got taken down, and I was forced to take an older version of the document and save it to a wiki I was running off my website. Still, given the persistence of this question, I think one of the best things I can leave this channel with before the hiatus is a re-examination of this document. Not necessarily a straightforward reading of what I wrote 1 or 2 years back, but an exploration of the topic, an overview of my main points, and an elaboration on those points concerning what I have learned about the ways to be a leader in the modern culture war and how best to form oneself into a leader in the modern culture war. So without further ado, I will begin an overview of the document Culture War and Content Creation. It's no secret today that the right has a serious leadership problem. This, more than anything else, is what is keeping the dissident right from getting a foothold in mainstream institutions. Largely, I think this deficit of leadership on the right is due to a number of misconceptions about how leaders are formed and how good leadership is attained. Regardless of whether leaders are born, e.g., regardless of whether there are epigenetic characteristics that make people good leaders, leaders are ultimately made. They're educated, they're trained, and as every counter-progressive worth his salt has realized by this time, every single institution that we have traditionally used to train leaders are firmly in progressive hands. As such, there's a leadership problem on the right that I think very few people have really taken stock of. To be quite honest, I've heard more dismissals and excuses as to why we don't need leaders than any genuine solution to this problem. Moreover, many of the solutions I do hear sound implicitly like excuses, sound more like explanations why we don't need leaders at all than any guide to the kind of leadership we do need and how to get it. In particular, there have been more or less 4 responses I've seen to the leadership crisis on the right, and these 4 reasons generationally divide into 2 camps. One that I oftentimes hear from boomers. These are the type of classic neoconservative excuses. And the second set of leadership approaches that I typically see from incredibly online younger millennials or Zoomers. To start with the boomer takes, the first general mistake I see from the older generation of right-wingers or conservatives is what I call the cyber Reagan answer. This is the belief that some large, big man or savior figure will appear on the national stage, almost always as a presidential candidate, who will set things right, make America great again, and restore whatever lost glory people are looking for when they're looking at the modern crisis and what right-wingers term clown world. Here, I use the term cyber Reagan to evoke the original instance of this savior figure happening in American history, or at least the most recent one that springs readily to mind, namely the Reagan Revolution of 1980, an election that seemed to draw America back from the leftward direction that seemed to be making it increasingly unstable and increasingly unrecognizable. You can obviously see echoes of this in Trump with his assertion that he wants to make America great again. However, for most people who are reactionary or on the distant right watching this, we realize that this hope is more or less misplaced. While political victories shouldn't be underplayed entirely, the belief in these type of central savior figures makes 2 key mistakes. First and most obviously, it ignores history. These characters, such as Ronald Reagan, did not constitute actual revolutions and did not largely hold back any of the social changes that they originally set out to confront. At most, they made a compromise with it and slowed it down. We can expect more of the same from Trump on this front. Secondly, these large political battles ignore the real root cause of the problem, which is not directly related to electoral politics, but lies deeper with educational institutions, with media organizations, with the people who form the narrative and teach the official truth to the next generation. In the end, this obsession with national figures draws right-wing attention away from where it really needs to be placed, in the culture, in the institutions that form the next generation. It turns any type of anti-progressive movement into a meaningless political lobbying organization, and one that will not be ultimately effective. As numerous reactionary authors have shown, not least of all Mencius Moldbug, this participation in Republican Party politics is ultimately ultimately futile, and if anything, fuels the progressive movement forward. Okay, well, maybe we need to start thinking beyond politics. Maybe we need to start thinking about things like culture, the things that form culture, communities, ways of intergenerationally holding power. But when this conversation starts, I find that boomers and much younger people who are channeling the spirit of the boomers tend to have two rather cute responses to the whole issue. Sure, we need to build community, we need to build our families, so the best way to do that is ignore politics, put your nose to the grindstone, don't worry about larger issues, and just work on being your own best person. Clean your room, bucko. Focus on your local community. Focus on your own individual life. Well, this should go without saying. We should all be doing these things. We should all be building our local community. We should all be focusing on our own virtue. We should all be building our own families and trying to become people who can support families. These are all laudable, necessary, and virtuous goals. But at the same time, they also are excuses. These pieces of advice are always given to end a conversation, not really to begin one. And regardless of how much we would like to believe that we can just focus on our own lives and ignore politics, well, we might not care about politics, but politics will eventually care about us. Individual virtue, while at some level more important, is not a surrogate for proper political and cultural activism. It's not a replacement for being a leader in a community and working collectively to push back against the incursion of progressivism in society. And I always have to remind myself that at one point I believed this. I believed that one could just make their own life well enough, and then participate in politics on the side once one had their own financial interests squared away. The activists that couldn't find jobs with their women's studies degree wouldn't ultimately change society, now would they? I think this illusion finally came to an end with the case of Brendan Eich. One of the founders of the most successful open source project of my generation, Mozilla Firefox, Eich was forced to resign, aka fired, from his own company when it became public that he had donated to an anti-gay marriage campaign. Would the voices of the successful engineers and people who had contributed to society ultimately win out? Donating to a political campaign is a legitimate act. It's a legitimate form of expression for people in a democratic society. But not in this case. Not in the case of Brendan Eich. The people who organized as activists ultimately ended up ruling his company, and he, the founder, was left to start from scratch. I can't speak for anyone else, but the last vestiges of my boomer conservatism died the day Brendan Eich lost his job. So, very well, the boomer takes on right-wing activism are out. And certainly the age of Trump has signaled a transition away from these approaches. New generations of right-wingers don't seem to be very enamored with either of these approaches to leadership or change. And I think this is a good thing. There is a new Zoomer right waiting in the wings. But in many ways, their approaches seem to be no less healthy or effective than the boomer ones they're supplanting. Now, while it's not for me, a millennial, to cast aspersions on a much younger generation's effort, I'm sure they'll think of more intelligent things as time goes on. I will here point out two of the more common approaches to politics that have entered into the right-wing sphere in this much more cynical and pessimistic age. The first approach to politics is what I jokingly refer to in internet lingo as meme magic. This is an approach that came into prominence in 2016 and largely was a form of being a keyboard warrior, an activist who communicated through posting things on various public forums. Disruptive jokes, an ironic lampooning of the establishment, organized campaigns of trolling that originally got their start in movements like Gamergate and became popular on online forums like 4chan. However, far from being the purview of simple internet jokers, this type of internet trolling keyboard activism had actual tangible results. Or at least it seemed so in 2016. It certainly was useful for getting the media off its narrative, which is more than can be said for anything that the mainstream conservative movement had done in a very long time. What meme magic or right-wing troll culture realized is that when one did not control the narrative, one could still direct the narrative by baiting those who they knew to be in control of that narrative structure. If you want something covered that the media wouldn't ordinarily talk about, do something objectionable, but not too objectionable, and have the media arrive to give you free press. This was the tactic employed by Donald Trump, but it was also used much later in campaigns like "It's okay to be white." It's a type of social engineering that works because the real guardians of the media and educational institutions aren't real guardians and aren't very intelligent to boot. But as we might expect, this approach has its limitations. First, it's purely a negative approach. Fair enough, the right wing is in the minority in all spheres of power that matter, but when a foothold is carved out, when a counter-narrative is started, it doesn't really go anywhere because there's no unified control, there's no unified activist community to take the helm. Pure cynicism rules, irony is always master, and entertainment and lulls always have to be part of the deal. In this way, later developments in the right-wing meme culture eventually could not sustain themselves. Here I'm thinking of things like internet blood sports. After having an initial surge of popularity, after creating an initial niche in the media space that their opponents just couldn't ignore, internet blood sports then proceeded to immediately burn out, since argument, contention, disunity, and drama had to be constantly supplied after they already had exhausted every single objectionable thing they could say to present a counter-narrative against the progressive mainstream. And ultimately, what was left in the wake of this enormous phenomenon of internet blood sports, for all the money spent on super chats, and for all the money that was spent implicitly on Google, they do get a fairly large cut. What was left in its wake? Not only was there no activist community, I don't even think there are any large YouTube channels that really do anything interesting that came out of this entire era of YouTube, and to be quite honest, the internet as a whole. In short, meme culture was able to seize the narrative, but it did not know how to secure any lasting power from that narrative. In sort of contrast, I hear another type of cynical reaction, mainly coming from Zoomers regarding the culture war and the current state of the right wing. And this reaction is accelerationism. The feeling that we just need to have things get worse before they get better. We need mainstream society to degrade more. We need mainstream institutions to disintegrate. Maybe we even need a new civil war to erupt. Then, in the chaos, then in the ruins, then in the chaos and confusion, something new can come. Now, people who watch this channel know that I've criticized accelerationism again and again, so I'm going to try to not belabor the point. And I should say at least one good thing about this. It is thinking out of the box. And to be honest, the left does this all the time. But when they call for civil war or accelerationism, they just call it quote-unquote revolution. A key framing technique which makes it seem like they're never really calling for anything radical or scary. But as I've said many times before, accelerationism doesn't work. You cannot plan for chaos. Moreover, if you're seen as an agent of chaos, people justifiably lose all faith in you. But even if this is too abstract, I will point out another feature of accelerationism that is less talked about, and that is that it's fundamentally lazy. Most people who use accelerationist language usually use it as an excuse not to build anything in the present era. After all, it's all going to get wiped away by war and chaos, isn't it? In many ways, as dark as accelerationism is, it can be quite satisfying. You buy a bunch of rations, sit on top of them, and imagine that you're going to be a king once the civil war finally comes. Once more, at the end of the day, nothing good has come of this. So then, what's the solution? How can we avoid these two pitfalls of thought? Well, first, I think by defining what we're really looking for. Once more, I think we are looking for leadership. We are looking for new political directions. But there is one key thing that the leadership roles discussed previously don't do. They don't build actual sustainable collective community right here and right now. They don't build a baseline that people can use. They don't build something that others can use going forward. They're either overly faithful in the present system, like our cyber Reagan strategy, or they're overly cynical, like the accelerationism strategy. They are either overly focusing on individual action and improvement, like the clean your room strategy, or they are overly nihilistic and cynical, like meme magic. What we need is a leadership that focuses on making a community, on building a community, and building things that people can take forward, that future right-wingers, who are not us, can use to their advantage, and that can employ as the struggle goes on, for however long the struggle needs to go on. And given the fallen nature of humanity, that may indeed be until the end of the world. We need leaders who build. We need leaders who support, who educate, who network, who foster others. But what does this even look like? What ways can we be leaders in actually effective ways? How can we create community and foster support, either in real life or online? In this first part of Culture War and Content Creation, I examine 9 different categories of leadership that I see as essential for any non-progressive movement going forward. These are roles that really any private individual can fill, if they have the inclination and talent, that is. And these are all roles that it seems that the present right-wing movement, or present dissident right-wing movement, have a real hard time doing. There is a need for these type of people to step forward, regardless of whether they're doing this professionally or just performing this activism in their spare time. So if the audience will permit, I'd like to walk through some of these archetypes. The first, and arguably one of the most important missing archetypes on the right now, is the archetype of the ambassador. The person out front, the person that everyone thinks of when they mention your particular political movement. The good guy, the lady or gentleman that exemplifies everything that the movement aspires to, that takes the ideas forward even when they might not be initially accepted. Now, I understand that there are any number of people who think that they are ambassadors for the right wing or for the distant right wing, but for my money, this job is not being done well enough. We can see this, I think, no more clearly than in the decline and fall of the movement once known as the alt-right. Now, of course, I've made it very clear in this channel that I have a number of ideological disagreements with the alt-right. Nevertheless, for other right-wingers, it's very interesting and useful to pick apart this movement's manifest failure. What went wrong? And while one can, and I have, pointed out a number of things wrong with the alt-right, there was one key problem with the entire movement, and that was they had no good ambassadors. Or at least no good ambassadors under the age of 50. Think about it. In 2016, the alt-right, which until that point was a community that existed in the fringe of the internet, was suddenly thrust into the public square, mainly by the stupidity of Hillary Clinton and the Democrats. In that moment, they became the face of opposition against a supremely unpopular presidential candidate, and later, after the Trump victory, they became seen as a prominent supporter of a not unpopular president. Everyone was asking, who are the alt-right? What do they stand for? And while the media was unquestioningly biased against them, this was an opportunity. CNN wanted to interview somebody. Who was sent? Well, in short, Richard Spencer. A person who looked and acted like a 1980s movie villain. And if it wasn't Richard Spencer, it was one more unsavory character, who seemed to have little understanding of optics outside of right-wing podcasts and 4chan. What persisted was gaffe after gaffe, with no one really learning the lesson of optics until it finally came to a head in Charlottesville. Oh, and I know that there were optically good alt-righters. Jared Taylor could do one hell of an interview, but each of these people were more or less holdovers from an earlier era. They were the old paleocons. They couldn't be the face of a new movement, certainly, and CNN would never perceive them as thus, and they had every incentive not to present them as thus. And I know this is a macrocosmic problem. None of us can really influence how, on a national scale, a movement is seen. But I think the problem with poor optics and poor ambassadors on the national scale was complemented by poor optics and poor ambassadors on a very, very local scale. The average person that most people knew as being associated with some kind of alt-right movement tended to be a very antisocial or neat individual, someone who already had reasons to not be very outgoing and generally have very poor relations with the rest of society. This was not going to end well for any movement. Now, to contrast this approach with an earlier movement that was looking to destigmatize a certain type of person, we could examine the gay rights movement between 1970 and 1999. This community had serious problems, including a very unhealthy lifestyle in major metropolitan areas where promiscuous, indiscriminate sex led to a number of deaths from STD outbreaks. Still, thanks to a handful of very prominent, very well-spoken, and very polite and likable celebrities that acted as ambassadors on a national level, and thanks to countless very sociable, very outgoing gay couples at the local level, America slowly began to acclimatize to people being gay. The homosexual became not the strange person in a nightclub at Stonewall, but became that charming couple next door. The homosexual became Liberace, became Elton John, but more importantly, became one's cousin, one's uncle, one's friend from high school. They were all good people. They all were perfectly sociable and nice people. And this wasn't accidental. It was cultivated by a movement in a community that knew what it wanted. Now, perhaps the right wing has, in some sense, learned its lesson at the larger level. I see people like Morrissey and even the Dalai Lama repeating and outright advocating for points that are necessarily dissident right, that have their origins on the populist right. Maybe there'll be a new generation of celebrity advocates for these ideas that are likable and that the media can't easily ignore. But unless this is met with a larger group of small ambassadors at the local level, I think these efforts are not going to take root. People need to hear about right-wingers and think about their own friends and think about how nice and outgoing those people are. I mean, they at least need to think of one person who's a good ambassador. In many ways, we might be sour on this idea. Previous evangelical movements in particular have made it a little bit of an irritating point to be overly nice to people, and oftentimes it feels like right-wingers can be doormats for people who despise them. Still, this is essential, and it's essential to do on a local level. To list an immediate local example, the type of traditionalist, reactionary, and dissident ideas that are typically talked about on online circles aren't really conceptualized among most ordinary religious believers, even most who are orthodox and generally conservative in their temperament. They consider these ideas to be scary and unusual, and the only way that an intellectual leadership are ever going to unify a community is to normalize these types of ideas among people who are, for lack of a better word, more normie. And to do this is going to require people to be ambassadors even in their own small local communities. And that takes a certain kind of leader. The next leadership archetype I think it's important to discuss is somewhat a contrasting figure to the ambassador. The ambassador being a figure almost entirely of optics, this leadership archetype is all about substance. And here I'm talking about the artist, or, to pick up internet terminology, the content creator. Now, we are a long way from the 90s and the 60s. The left and progressives no longer have a monopoly on creativity. And as every day goes by, they seem less and less able to tap into that revolutionary energy that animated works of leftist art in the past. But while right-wingers are fond of claiming that they are indeed the new counterculture, they don't seem to be really taking up the mantle when it comes to producing actual works of art. Part of this is not really the right's fault. Many people who make up the right haven't been trained to be creative, haven't been trained to be artists. They've gone through educational systems that have dissuaded, to some extent, people of their ideological persuasion from taking on this particular job type, or even seeing themselves as creative people. Living in California, I see this all the time. Right-wing and blue-collar people don't even feel like they can write something original. They don't even think that they have a story within them, even though their lives may be fairly interesting. They've been to war, they've worked a variety of different jobs, they've loved and lost. At the same time, it seems that any and every upper middle class, white, teenager, or college student immediately considers themselves a great novelist and creator, even if their career spans only to writing Harry Potter fanfic. There's a cultural disconnect here. In the past, I think a lot of right-wing content creation has been hindered from being over-ideological. Christians have produced movies like God is Not Dead. Right-wingers have produced books that are thinly veiled political propaganda. And this is a mistake that the left hasn't made. The left understands that when art is concerned, only the true, the good, and the beautiful can be given priority in any sense. Any political message that comes must come as a secondary effect of the actual work itself. As such, I think there are two main hurdles that right-wing creators need to overcome when it comes to taking on the role of the artist. First, they need to give themselves permission to create in the first place, which, for everyone involved, implicitly means permission to fail. Second, they need to give themselves permission to put aside their explicit ideological commitments and just let their own impressions of truth and beauty take them where it will. It almost certainly will be a scary journey, but it will be worth it in the end. I have to pause here to say that the role of the artist is one of the most difficult roles to fill in any type of community. In addition to actually creating things that are highly personal to yourself, you have to sustain others' criticism of them, which is not easy. Moreover, unlike many of the other roles, collaboration and community support really can't get you very far at all. Regardless of what anyone says, artistic creation is almost always an individual contribution. One person's vision and perspective on the world is always driving the effort, and while the community can act as a sounding board, and will probably provide you more criticism than you ever wanted, it still can't really help directly with any process of creation that's worth anything. However, for those people who are interested in taking this route, directly creating novels and music, paintings, sculpture, and other forms of narrative fiction, I will provide one piece of preemptive advice, and that is focus on finishing things. A lot of people who aspire to be novelists or artists like keeping a lot of open projects, and that can be useful, but unless you finally finish something and hit save, until you finally put it in a form where you feel comfortable giving it to someone else to read or consume, you haven't really done the thing in question. You haven't really completed the art form. I think a lot of people find it comforting to always be in the middle of projects because they never can really get any criticism. But at the same time, they can't really grow as creators either. You can only begin to fail at something when you finish a final project. So in my own experience, take on the smallest possible project that you're likely to finish if you want to start in any artistic endeavor. But of course, I don't consider myself an artist, so my advice on this front might not be worth very much at all. But to segue onto another role that I do have a large amount of experience on, the next leadership archetype that is needed by the right is that of the engineer. Now, if you watch my videos, you'll know that I am an engineer by trade. And this is not very unusual because engineering has very classically been a profession that's appealed to right-wingers. But that being said, the right-wing movement has an engineering disadvantage. In addition to its institutional disadvantage, in addition to its disadvantage in terms of people power, there is also a support disadvantage in terms of technology. Any activist movement is like a corporation, and corporations rely on physical capital, support systems that facilitate financial transactions, that communicate ideas, that help in organization. This makes organization possible at a large scale, and unfortunately at this time, most of these large support systems, at least on the internet, are completely owned by people who are affiliated with the progressive movements. In addition to creating alternatives that are desperately needed in the field of technology and social networks, there is also a need for technical support to people who might have good ideas but don't really have a mastery over the technical aspect of making videos, or even making a blog. How many brilliant right-wing thinkers might never start a good YouTube channel because they can't figure out how to use OBS? How many existing right-wingers are going to have their careers unceremoniously ended in the next 10 years when the social media platforms finally kick them off? If this problem isn't addressed, it's going to spell doom for the community, one way or the other. And while we might hope that there is going to be at some point a political solution, we're going to have to start with engineering solutions. And these engineering solutions are going to have to be organized. And here I think organization is the real crux. I know that there are any number of people out there working on software projects from a right-wing perspective. Perhaps most notably among them, one of the fathers of neo-reactionary thought, Mencius Mollbug, has been working on a software project called Urbit. Still, what I see as the big deficit in right-wing engineering efforts is a lack of organization and leadership. We don't need 1,000 different software projects that no one knows about. We need an organized alliance, or what I'd like to think of as an alternative technology alliance, a place where people can go to collaborate, to figure out what projects are in the works and what projects have already been accomplished, a way that everyone can get on the same page. But this is a large topic, and I may reference this in future videos. The next leadership archetype I'd like to talk about is one that's come in for a good deal of scorn, at least in many normie right-wing circles, and this is the figure of the intellectual, the public researcher, the theoretician, the egghead. Now, as I've said in many of my previous videos, I am somebody who is by their disposition very skeptical of theory and abstractions about human principles at a very, very high level. Nevertheless, my skepticism aside, I can say that the existence of intellectuals and theoreticians is very, very important, even on a practical level. Now, it's become de rigueur in normie conservative circles to put down intellectuals as people who make meaningless theoretical abstractions about complex systems which they don't really understand. Nevertheless, this has a role to play, and I think we can see it if we look at our counterparts on the left. Take any left-wing YouTuber, really any one of them, from cuck philosophy to ContraPoints, from non-compete to Three Arrows. Whenever they talk about their own ideas, whenever they talk about things that they commend, the progressive core, they never introduce the concepts as their own ideas. They reference other intellectuals. They reference theory. This has a number of advantages. In addition to saving each of the creators time that can be better spent on their art of presentation and education, it also abstracts conflicts. You're not really disagreeing with me, you're disagreeing with Adorno or Marx or Kropotkin. This minimizes the amount of conflict that can be generated and deflects criticisms that might come from outside or even inside the community. You can't criticize a left-wing YouTuber's ideas without taking on a mountain of existing theory, of existing literature on the topic. Thus, if a left-winger doesn't feel like debating, they can simply reference their sources and ask that you educate yourself first by reading 10,000 pages of Marxist or anarchist literature. But in addition to deflecting criticism and avoiding conflict, the existence of theory also provides a basis to keep everyone on the same message. and more importantly, using the same language inside a political content creation community. Everyone inside of LeftTube or BreadTube knows what class consciousness is. They all know what the declining rate of profit is, or at least they know how to use it in a sentence to signal that they're on the same page with people ideologically. As such, the common phenomenon of LeftTube emerges, where everyone seems to be speaking the same language and seems to be on point on the same couple of issues. Everyone knows that intersectionality is good. Everyone knows that postmodern Marxism isn't a thing. Everyone knows that labor theory of value is totally serious as an economic model and is the reigning orthodoxy in contemporary economic theory. True or not, this provides a common language for people inside the community where they can express ideas very efficiently. Love him or hate him, I think on the right wing, the best equivalent we have any time in the last 50 years is Mencius Mollbug, a sort of crackpot internet figure who, while certainly introducing some very interesting ideas, had any number of really bad ideas as well. But more than putting any given idea into circulation, more than commending neo-cameralism or patchwork, I think the real contribution of Mollbug to the current right-wing community is linguistic. We now have a set of theoretical terms that everyone is using. We can talk about the cathedral. We can reference how Cthulhu always swims to the left. And everyone knows more or less what we're talking about. We don't need to constantly re-demonstrate these principles every time a conversation occurs. And this is what theory can give to a community. Once more, on the right wing, I think this is woefully underdeveloped. We just don't have the presence in the academy to have fully developed theory the way the left does. But this problem in itself is an opportunity for those who consider themselves public intellectuals. We need to develop new right-wing theory. We need to publish papers. We need to write books. We need to create linguistic frameworks to talk about and understand modern problems. And this is going to require a number of intellectual leaders to write these books, to write these papers, and to hold these conversations. Unlike being a novelist or an artist, I think that being an intellectual is, or I should say can be, a more collaborative experience. You can work together with people. But at the end of the day, the ideas that are generated need to be written down. They need to be stored in a permanent fashion. They need to be referenceable by the general community. An idea is all well and good, but it only gains wings when people start citing it, when it's not just one person with their own crackpot view of the world, and it becomes an entire intellectual tradition with its own literature. That is a powerful apparatus, and we've only just started laying the foundation. And here, when I mention foundation, I have to implicitly talk about another great deficit. Another great obstacle when it comes to developing these leaders. Creating a community that might link together interested intellectuals, interested artists, and engineers working together to build some larger project. And that is the lack of proper documentation, the lack of a proper archive of previous right-wing work. The next type of leadership I think the right needs is the archetype of the archivist, the librarian, the documenter and organizer, the person who is aware what has gone on in the past and is able to put it in a place where those who are interested can find it easily. I think in the present day, this is more or less entirely an online role, although I wouldn't be surprised if there were some in real life applications for people who liked organizing things. Nevertheless, it's worth it to mention that when it comes to developing any big intellectual project, especially across the other roles we described in terms of art, engineering, or other intellectual work, people need to know what has been done before. They also need to know possible collaborators, possible people they are competing against. Whenever you're starting on a creative task, you always need to know what has gone before you. You need to be able to use and cite things that have worked, interesting ideas that you want to build on. You can't start from square one. But to this date, there is very little documentation surrounding right-wing ideas in an organized fashion. This is a huge deficit, but also a huge opportunity. Not only to link together other right-wingers, but also to document the many insanities of progressives and leftists. For those of you who have had conversations with progressives or have even debated them, you'll know that one of the favorite tracks progressives take is to deny the many insanities that we see from them on a daily basis. What are you talking about, they'll say. No one is saying that whiteness is bad. No one is saying abortion is good. No one is saying that Christianity is evil, when we all know that there are many instances where leftists say each of those things. But without a central place to look for these insanities, without a central place to reference what has been said in the past and by whom, you'll be hard-pressed to come up with an example inside the conversation, or even within the space of a few days, unless you want to dedicate yourself to a research session. As such, the left wing can get away with no amount of bullshit, and then deny it afterwards, safe in the assumption that the right-winger has no way to fully document what has happened in the past. Mind you, the left doesn't suffer from this problem. They have organizations like Right Wing Watch who do just this. And if Right Wing Watch isn't well funded enough, well, they always have CNN and the rest of the mainstream media to remind them about that. In this age of tit for tat, I don't think that any right-wing movement has any choice but to follow suit. And I know that there do exist some databases, like Campus Watch, that document many of the insanities that occur from the left side of the spectrum, but these typically are organized around specific organizations, specific campaigns, and they're not nearly as extensive as we need them to be. They're also not open to the public to edit and add to, generally speaking. People who are interested in being archivists, in documenting the enemy, need to take the next step. A large collaborative community of people who document good right-wing ideas and document bad left-wing behavior. Some of us within the Canon Society have started doing this by creating a wiki, which from my own experience is a good start. It is a place where ideas can be documented and discussed in a more or less open fashion with quality controls. And while I don't want this effort to curtail any future efforts that might take things in a different direction, I will say that this was easier than I thought it would be to start, and it has been very useful. A more organized effort would almost certainly bear fruit. I think that this transitions very well into the next leadership role, because as much as we have information itself needs to be dispersed. There's a difference between organizing and storing, and training, educating, forming up new leaders and new activists. Here, I'd like to talk about the archetype of the educator or cleric, the support role, another form of leadership that I think that mainstream conservatives have really discounted, and discounted to their own detriment. Activism and leadership is communication, and in many ways there is no better communication than that of education. The only way out of the right's current predicament is to master education, to become master teachers, and also, while we're at it, master disciples. Without educators, there is no way to circumvent the modern academy, which is where most of these terrible progressive ideas come from. Homeschooling is essential. Networks of homeschool and directed homeschool are essential. Private schools are essential. But in addition to these tried and true apparatuses of the conservative establishment, we also need to be thinking beyond just homeschooling. Education is a continuous process. The second you stop learning, you might as well be dead. And if our community is going to develop new leadership of any kind in the short term, it has to start educating those leaders. Now, this is easier said than done. Being a good teacher is truly an astonishing thing. But in addition to the great teachers, we also just need people who are attempting to teach, even if they're doing not the best job in the world. Oftentimes, being an educator is a thankless job, and it is one of the most time-consuming ways you can spend being a leader, even though it's one of the most important ones. That being said, it is not impossible, even for amateurs. If other people are doing their job, then there will be information available on any given topic, any given ideological topic. What remains to teach, at least in a very basic capacity, is to take this information and translate it into some form that your audience can understand and interact with. Not a simple order, but not an impossible task. In many ways, most people on the left see themselves as educators and not as ideas people. And this has worked well for them, I think. While you could argue that we do not want to replicate the type of ineffectual individuals that come out of progressive education, I don't think we need to go down the same route. We can draw upon older sources and find people who want to form themselves into leaders. In this way, supporting an education will be a critical step. It will drive forward all the other forms of leadership, given enough time. And this is something that our movement does need to dedicate time to. We need to be there for people, even people who haven't fully come to understand ideas, or who have not yet developed the skills necessary to execute those ideas. For the right wing currently, I think a number of barriers exist. For the time being, at least, most of the dissident right exists only online, and as such, education has to be done through blogs and videos. An attempt to replicate the classroom environment online has not been entirely successful, largely because the presenter can't impose any type of discipline on students that are nowhere near him physically. Moreover, education in the real world, even education done inside conservative institutions, comes up against a number of barriers. Normie conservatives are afraid of distant ideas, and there's no way you're going to use progressive institutions to spread concepts or even training that the cathedral does not approve of. As such, for in-real-life education to thrive in this capacity, new spaces and new communities need to be formed in real life. And if relations are built online, then those relationships need to be deeper and longer lasting, and less just transient communications with faceless voices on the internet. And at this point, I want to bring up another leadership role, one that I don't see very many people talking about, one that I don't think has even been properly conceptualized by the left or the right for a very long time. And this leadership role is that of the host or the hostess. This person is, in a word, a bridge, a pathway for communication and expansion of people inside a community. He or she creates a space where people who are allied can meet, and makes that space a place where growth can be achieved. In some ways, this role is like the ambassador, but unlike the ambassador, the host does not really deal with outsiders, but more or less deals with insiders in a community, people who are already part of the space, people who are already part of the collective. It's also a little bit like the educator, but as opposed to guiding a disciple forward in a mode of learning, the host really just makes things available. Once more, he or she creates a space for growth, rather than driving the growth themselves. In many ways, there are two necessary elements to being a proper host or hostess. The first is to develop oneself as a cultural highbrow in whatever milieu you operate within. If you're someone who focuses on Christian or Western culture, one should be reasonably educated in Christian or Western culture. And I might add, truly grow to experience or like that culture. The second thing is to have a certain likability and empathy that can be used to draw in other people and form up groups of people who are interested in the same or similar things to you. The end goal is to create a sort of contagious environment of interest, to create groups where people naturally glom on to the best elements of each other and copy them in their own lives. In essence, the host or hostess addresses the key truth that culture is a collective experience, and any true experience of culture has to be done collectively. In reality, classical music is just as pleasant and as fun to listen to as pop music, and Game of Thrones is no more interesting than Shakespeare or Tolstoy's War and Peace. The problem with all of these experiences, however, is that we always experience great literature and classical music in isolation, whereas we know that pop music and the latest HBO TV shows will be talked about with our friends and coworkers. The experience would be quite different if we had a group of people to do these things with. If there were common interest groups for classical music, or book groups for reading great literature. Once the collective community interest changes, the entire dynamics around things that were at one point unattainable changes. I think it goes without saying that the host or hostess role is predominantly an in-real-life role. At one point, I think many people believed that Discord or some other social media might be able to surrogate for a cultural community. This, of course, before the large-scale bans started. But I found this difficult even without the ban-happy social media moderators. Once again, it's hard to get anyone to do anything hard when people don't physically see you in real life. Without that physical presence, you're more or less just a disembodied voice online. However, I have seen the sort of spirit of the host come up in several YouTube channels. People like Critical Condition, who, while not actually doing the work of a hostess, is certainly channeling the energy of a hostess inside the production value of her videos. Nevertheless, more work needs to be done. Right-wingers, or people who are generally interested in older culture, need to have people that they meet up with and experience the culture together with them. And those experiences are always driven around certain central personalities, certain central hosts or hostesses. This is a tall order, but I think it might be getting easier. As the Academy becomes more and more woke, they will increasingly consider more and more of the classic Western canon to be verboten, racist, sexist, and homophobic. As such, people who like these things will be looking for alternative communities, and this is a place where an entrepreneurial right-winger might be able to form a new community that might be more receptive to dissident ideas. This is how culture is created. But while culture is important, I did want to separate the roles of people who predominantly worked in culture with what I see to be a much, much larger and deeper mission. As much as we talk about culture being upstream from politics, there is something upstream from culture, and that is spirituality. I know atheists might differ on this, even right-wing atheists, but I think that the source of most problems in the West today undoubtedly have a spiritual origin. We are no longer faithful people by and large. We no longer believe in some transcendent reality or some transcendent good outside of ourselves. And without that central belief and faith in a higher power, I'm not so sure that any of our efforts are really going to come to much in the long term, regardless of how intelligently they're planned in the short term. Given this reality, another leadership archetype that is desperately, desperately needed is that of the spiritual leader. People need what Christianity has to offer, and the current set of Christian leaders is just not up to the task. Starting on a very superficial level, the apologetic approaches that one typically sees from Christian leaders are terrible. They're essentially recycled C.S. Lewis, the type of William Lane Craig arguments only and hard sell evangelization. This really appeals to very few people, and was shown, I think, to be quite ineffective against their chief rivals, the New Atheists of 2008 and 2009. Christian spirituality and Christian apologetics need to get out of the box they've been trapped in for the last 50 years. Part of this is going to be developing new apologetic approaches, new approaches to the faith that make sense to people in modernity. This, of course, is something that I don't really have a lot of experience with. It's not really my area at all, but I know it needs to be done. And it's something that genuine apologists need to start looking at, rather than just playing copy pasta with the work of William Lane Craig or C.S. Lewis. However, on a much deeper level, I think spiritual leadership extends much further than simple apologetics. Most people come to an understanding of the holy by looking at examples, by looking at models of people who are more spiritually aware and more spiritually connected than they are. Therefore, I think there is no better spiritual leadership than true spiritual awareness of oneself, than to build the deep relationship between yourself and the higher power. to build one's connection with the Holy Spirit, and then to bring that Spirit forward into the real world, not simply through words, but also through example. Once again, I think this is a very, very tall order, but just to begin, I think proper spiritual leadership begins with proper spiritual practice, demonstrating the centrality of prayer in your life by actually praying, and not being afraid to carry that forward into the public space. Once more, people have to be aware of their cultural surroundings. Certainly, practices will be perceived and received differently in different times and places, but our priorities have to always be set properly, and first things have to come first. There is no more foundational level of leadership than the archetype of the spiritual leader. And even for people looking to pursue other forms of leadership, spirituality is a good place to start. And this role, this archetype of the spiritual leader, would be the last role I would mention, except for the fact that I feel it necessary to talk about one other key archetypical role, one other type of leadership that is really essential, if somewhat unfocused. And this archetypical role is that of the networker. The person who knows people, the person who can connect other interested individuals and get them to work together on projects. With very few exceptions, each of these archetypical leadership roles relies on having a community of support to a greater or lesser extent. Without making connections, most of these endeavors are ultimately futile, and so it can be very hard to find a place to start. Of course, social media has taken care of some of this problem to a certain extent, but for most in-real-life relations, nothing is necessarily that easy. And in this place, I think the networker is a critical piece of the puzzle. Most communities are started because there is one central figure who knows everyone, who remembers names and faces, something that I myself am singularly bad at doing. Nevertheless, there are always those people who, once you know them, you're immediately plugged into everyone else who might share your interests. This is how most communities get started, these keystones, these centerpieces that connect everyone together. The networker themselves might not be particularly a leader in any given way. They might not even have a given area of expertise in a political or cultural sense. Nevertheless, they play a critical role. Oftentimes, in our own 21st century age, it's easy to be a shut-in. It's easy not to meet people, to remain in our own isolated bubble. In fact, the internet encourages this. But I think a critical way of breaking out of this bubble is to just get interested in people. Always say yes to in-real-life engagements. Try to remember names and faces, but if you fail at that, write it down. Always ask what people are up to, and see other people you interact with as people who have their own projects, who love people, things, and ideas. Once we do that, I think deeper roots and deeper connections will be formed, and the networking leaders will naturally evolve. This, in the end, is the way to establish a broader community, and a deeper one. And the first step comes from building relationships. 1, 2, 3, or as many as you can. And with this leadership role, I think we truly have completed the set. From the ambassador who presents the public face of the community, to the artist who creates content, culture, and vision to the community, to the engineer who builds its foundation, to the intellectual who justifies that foundation with theory and connects it to ideas, to the archivist who remembers things and information for the community, to the educator who takes that information and forms that education with people to make new leaders, to the host or hostess who forms communities and spaces for those communities to thrive, to the spiritual leader who provides the foundations in holiness and connection to the divine and transcendent, and finally to the networker and the group of friends who draw the whole thing together. If we want to build a new right-wing community, if we want to build new and better right-wing activism, it is going to start with one of these 9 archetypes, and with working to form ourselves into one of these 9 archetypes. We need to become the leaders that we want to see in the world. And this is not a meaningless bromide meant to stand in the way of true political and collective action. The leaders are the collective. They are what unifies the individual to the group. They are what makes the strength of the pack the wolf, and the strength of the wolf the pack. Starting here with leadership is the best place I can figure out to kick off this examination about the culture war and content creation. But I think this begs a separate question. Given that we know these leadership types are essential and that leadership generally is needed, how do we become better leaders? How do we form ourselves into the leaders that we know we need to take the movement forward? This is an interesting question, and I will be examining it in part 2 of this series, The Culture War and Content Creation.